and welcome to another exciting episode of We Have a Meeting. So I'm thrilled to have a truly exceptional guest joining us today. He's an expert in the art of humour, a maestro of communication and a trailblazer in the world of workplace success. He's a TED talker. Please give a warm welcome to the renowned humour engineer and best-selling author, Andrew Tarvin. Andrew, how are you?
I'm doing well. I mean, I feel delighted just in my soul a little bit. I don't know if I've ever been called a maestro before. So I appreciate that. Of the adjective you shared, I'm feeling pretty good right now.
Good. You're the first person I've called a maestro all week as well. So it does mean it comes from a genuine place. Mm-hmm. It's great to have you, Andrew. I'm really looking forward to this because me and Zach like to think we're funny. We like to try and incorporate humour into everything we do on a daily basis, but you actually are the humour engineer. So I guess probably a good place to start for anyone that's listening. Who are you and what problem do you solve?
Wonderful question. And so, maybe I'll answer that by defining humour engineer. Because as far as I know, according to Google searches and things like that, I'm the world's first humour engineer, which means that it's just clearly a title that I made up. But it comes from the background. So my background is in computer science and engineering, and I spent 6 years at Procter & Gamble as an IT project manager solving problems using computer science, using technology, programming, etc. And so once I started helping organizations use humor to solve problems, things like employee engagement, stress management, etc., your own personal workplace satisfaction, I was like, I think that makes me a humour engineer. I think, that's what I'm doing is I'm using humor to solve these problems. And so it is very much that intersection of those two things because people are often surprised, wait, like background in computer science and engineering, and yet, you think you're funny. That doesn't necessarily translate or correlate. And that's very much part of my story and my journey is that I'm not a naturally funny person. All of this that I know how to do has been learned. And if I, as an introverted computer geek from, Cincinnati, Ohio, can learn how to do it, I'm fairly certain most anyone else can as well.
Fascinating. Okay, so say I'm somebody that you might work with. What symptoms might I have? What might I be seeing on the surface where I'm like, what? Get a humour engineer on the phone. We need somebody to come and resuscitate us with some good dad jokes.
Well, and that's the interesting thing is very few people are sitting around after an employee review or that kind of thing thinking like, what I need is humor in the workplace. In fact, there's only to geek out about it, there's only probably about 1,000 global monthly searches for that phrase humor in the workplace. And so it's less about saying, okay, people knowing that they need humor as a solution and more about what problems do exist. Exactly to your point. What are your pain points? So some of them are around, say, as an individual workplace satisfaction. If you are dreading your work on, Sunday evening or even Sunday morning, like if you cannot enjoy Sunday because you have to think about all the terribleness that you're going to go through and work on Monday and through the rest of the week, then that might be a sign like, okay, yeah, you probably need to find ways to enjoy your work a little bit more. If you're so completely stressed out and overwhelmed that you don't have the energy or capacity or wherewithal or desire to do something fun after work, if you're just completely conked out in a shell of a human being after work, that could be a symptom. Or if you're a shell of a human in the workplace, if you're feeling like, oh, I have to be this different person, I put on this work face and I'm not authentically me, then that could be a signal for humor in the workplace. Or if you're just like, I'm totally boring. Like when I lead meetings, no one listens and they're awful and I'm bored out of my own mind in my own meetings. That was one of the signals to me was that I needed to, a little bit of change, was that I found myself in this incredibly terribly boring meetings, and it was one of those meetings where you like daydream about other things you wish you could be doing instead of being in that meeting, and it wasn't even fun things. I was like, I'd rather be folding laundry right now, or like maybe I should schedule a root canal so I feel something again. Like, and I remember looking around the room, and one of the people in the room had written the word blah on a sheet of paper, and then she was just like circling it over and over and over again, like, and that particular meeting was particularly terrible because I was the one leading it. I was the one talking that whole. So if you're having those types of moments, either that extreme of like completely stressed out, overwhelmed, or the other extreme of like bored out of your mind and terrible at what you do, humor can be a solution to a lot of those different things. Not the same, solution, but different aspects of humor can kind of apply. And that's our goal, is we want to try to create more enjoyable work experiences and help you to enjoy your work more while also doing it better.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for the first time in the podcast. So in a world where people appear to be slightly more easily offended than they once were, what would you say to the CEO or decision maker who says, you know what, it's probably safer to avoid humor in general, just so we don't risk crossing any boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways that you can frame that. One, you might say, well, technically, anytime you speak, you could offend someone. So let's just, switch to pantomime and word symbols and hieroglyphs, right? So just because there are some risks to any particular skill, and I'm not saying that humor should be used all the time for everything and that all humor goes. There's certainly risks and some dangers to using it. But that doesn't mean we ignore it completely, because in fact, I think that at least when I'm working with CEOs, I do ask that question, hey, what are the dangers to using humor, right? You might offend someone, or people may not take you as seriously, or people might be confused, right? There are some risks. You might distract people. But I also ask the question of what are some dangers to not using humor? What happens if you use no humor whatsoever? And that is sometimes also a big risk, right? People are then either bored, or they're not authentic, or they're not engaged. And in fact, we do some work with some pretty serious organizations. So we've done work with the United Nations, the FBI, the Red Cross. And there was actually a gentleman at the Red Cross who shared with me that he was like, the reason why we want to do this is that in our work, boredom has very serious consequences. Right? Just because something is important doesn't mean that it's inherently interesting. And so in the case of the Red Cross, if they're teaching what to do if a tornado comes, and you're so bored out of your mind with how they present that they're on their phone or they're daydreaming about that root canal that they're going to get someday, then they're not going to know what to do when an actual tornado comes. That's the serious consequences that come a little bit later. And so what we say is if what you're doing is important, if it matters to you, then you would want to use any tool that you have in your tool belt to do it more effectively, of which humor is just one, right? It's not the only thing to do, but just one. And so obviously that means that the type of humor that we use, and we can talk about what it means to have appropriate humor, inappropriate humor, et cetera, if you want to, but I would say to completely ignore it means that you're shutting down an incredibly effective way to engage humans.
Okay. So the boredom example that you used then was interesting, right? So is the antidote to that to be the softly feather duster, or is it to come in like crashing through the walls like a hammer and totally change everything and slap everyone around the face? Like, how do you actually treat something like that to start off with?
I mean, it doesn't have to be a complete, 180 in terms of your personality, your presentation style, etc. It can be small tweaks, I think. So to continue this example of the person with the Red Cross, we didn't turn them into a stand-up comedian where now they're going to give their entire presentations with a bunch of, jokes and a rubber chicken sticking out of a suitcase or whatever. Like, although, shout out to Tim Gard, who's a phenomenal keynote speaker who uses that type of stuff. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to go that extreme. In fact, that's one of the big fears that people have is they're like, but what if I'm not naturally funny? Or what if I could never do that? And what we've discovered in our work is that if humor is a skill and it means that it can be learned, then the question isn't, are you funny? The question is, what kind of funny are you? Or what kind of funny do you want to be? And we've discovered there's 7 primary ways people tend to express their humor in the workplace, what we call kind of the 7 primary humor personas. And we want to encourage people to start with whatever comes more naturally to them, right? Not saying, oh, I have to pretend and do something completely opposite or antithetical to how I am normally, but start small, smart little things to capture attention kind of along the way.
Could you run us through those 7 and maybe like a little one-liner with it, so people that are, all the salespeople or people that are listening can go, oh my God, I didn't realize I was number 4.
Yeah, maybe I'm that one for sure. And we can go deeper into any one or all of them as we go through. But high level, the 7 are: the first is the enthusiast. And the enthusiast is someone who just appreciates daily life. They're the person who is finding humor in small situations, or laughing, they're smiling a lot. An enthusiast might be someone who just like, hey, I'm a little bit stressed right now, so I'm going to go to YouTube, watch a couple of comedy videos, laugh a little bit, relieve some stress, and be good to go, right? So that's the enthusiast, is enjoying a little bit more the appreciation of life in some ways, in a humorous way. Next, you have the curator. The curator is someone who is able to take the things that they find funny. Maybe they see a funny video or an image or a GIF or a meme or whatever, and then they just share that with someone else. They curate that humor for another experience. So you could do that. A lot of people do that with their friends anyway. You might have that group chat with some of your friends where you're like, here's this funny video that I saw. You can also do that in a work context. You could share a funny image. You didn't create the image, but you could share that image in a presentation, right? So that's a curation where you don't have to be the funny one. You're just sharing the funny stuff that's already out there. Then you go into the inventor, and the inventor is the first one in terms of creating humor. This is around someone that might be good at writing. Maybe they understand the things like setup and punchline or a comic trip one. They may not be able to deliver it. Like maybe they get nervous speaking in front of other people, but if they can write it, or if they can do a tweet or a thread, I guess now these days, or whatever, like they're going to be good at putting it into paper, the crafting of humor. Then you have the entertainer. This is who we think of most often when we think of the funny person. This is the person who can like hold a conversation, who is a storyteller. They may not even know why they're funny. They just know that they're able to make people laugh when they talk. Then you have the engineer. So I'm the engineer. This is a person who is very specific around using humor for specific reasons. So, I'm going to use humor in this story, like in the start of this presentation to get people to pay attention. Or I'm going to use humor in the bottom of this email so that people are more likely to read it, or whatever. Like has a much more intent about solving problems. And you have the advocate. The sixth one is the advocate. The advocate is someone who is creating the space for other people to be funny. They're the ones, maybe they're not really funny themselves, but there might be the, what we call in the business kind of the straight person, in the sense of like they're setting other people up. Or they might be the facilitator that's creating a wonderful space. So in a very kind of like high level example of this, in some ways, Zach is an advocate of creating the space for these conversations, right? In terms of the first one to reach out, etc. So, or Jack in general, you all creating the space to like, hey, let's create a space for some type of person to come on and speak. That's the advocate. And then the final one is the skeptic. And I'll be honest, when we first kind of were thinking about the skeptic as a persona, for me it was kind of like, well, if you just don't think that I'm funny, then you're a curmudgeon and we're going to call you a skeptic. And, shame on you for not laughing more. But we realized that the skeptic as a persona can be very valuable, particularly in the workplace, because a skeptic has this consideration. They're like, is that going to be appropriate for everyone? Yes, it might be funny to a small portion of the audience, but will anyone be offended or otherwise? So it's kind of like the balancing the consideration of things. And so what you'll probably notice about that as you hear them is a couple of things. Is one, there might be one, but there might also be two or three that you identify with. You might say, oh, well, sometimes when I'm with my friends and enough alcohol, I might be, more of the entertainer. But in this group chat with my family, I'm actually more of a curator. And at night, sometimes with my spouse, I'm an enthusiast or what. So the idea isn't that these are set personalities. It's not that you can only be one. The intent is you can learn all seven. And if you want to be a very effective humorist, you can and should learn all seven, but there's probably one or two that you more naturally identify with, and that's where we encourage people to start.
Brilliant. I love that. So we work in sales. We have a lot of sales people listen to the podcast, and I'm sure you sit a lot of new business meetings. People reach out to you, Andrew, and say, Andrew, we love you. We've read your book. We've watched your TED Talk. We want to work with you. But then you have to sit down with them and say, you can work with me, but you're probably going to have to pay me a lot of money because I'm the only humour engineer in the world. So when you're bringing that sales approach, are you still the engineer, or for maybe salespeople listening, what persona out of the seven would be best to adopt when selling and to build rapport and trust?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think in a single sales kind of interaction, you may use all seven or multiple ones, right? So I think one of the things that we miss, particularly in sales, is, as most people know, really effective sales starts with really effective listening skills. It's about asking the right questions and then shutting up and hearing what those challenges are so that you can kind of mirror that back and say, because you've said this, I recommend that, right? That's a great kind of magic phrase coming from Phil Jones, Exactly What to Say. Fantastic kind of sales speaker, wonderful book, Exactly What to Say. But we need to be able to take that in, right? Phil Jones also says that like to prescribe before diagnosing would be malpractice in medicine, should be the same thing in sales. To immediately go in and be like, this is what you need without even knowing what the other person actually needs isn't good sales technique. And so you might start out more as the enthusiast. You ask a question and then by responding, the enthusiasm doesn't have to be like laughing when it doesn't make sense, but maybe you're nodding along. Maybe you're kind of giving that active listening and say, hey, I'm paying attention, or like, what was that? Can you share that? And smiling a little bit. And if they do attempt to crack a little bit of humor, this is the other thing that we say is like, there's no limit to the amount that you can laugh in a day. You can't use up laughter. And so if you're in a sales interaction or if you're with a coworker, whatever it happens to be, and they share a joke that isn't the funniest thing in the world, it doesn't cost you anything to laugh or smile. It's not like you laugh at this mediocre joke in the morning and then suddenly you go home, watch Netflix with your spouse or cat or whoever, and suddenly you like try to laugh, but you're physically unable to, like, I shouldn't have laughed at that joke earlier. It's gone now. Like, no. You can be a little bit more freeing, more giving. And so that's what the enthusiast does, because it feels really good to have one engage in that level, to be kind of fully engaged. And that's when an enthusiast can provide. So that's what I would say is from a salesperson, absolutely. You're starting probably as an enthusiast listening. You are then, prior to that, we encourage pretty much any salesperson to know their origin story. Right, so kind of I'm a huge nerd in pretty much all capacities, which is a surprise to no one, I don't think. But origin story, kind of like Marvel, is like, why are you doing what you're doing? How did you get to where you are? And if you learn that story, one, you can add a lot of humor in it, right? So I talk about in my origin story, I a lot of times say like, I am a nerd. And if you're wondering what type of nerd, the answer is yes. Computer, math, sci-fi, Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars, Star Trek, Starbucks, all of them, right? But most specifically, I'm an engineer. And then I talk a little bit about being an engineer and then learning about how like my obsession with efficiency didn't really work, and that led me to effectiveness, and how improv and stand-up helped me to get more, like yada, yada, yada. But that story can be 1 minute, can be 3 minutes, can be 5 minutes, but it's littered with humor, so people are laughing, but they're also getting to know me. Why do I do this thing? So as a salesperson, that can help. Okay, what led you to this role and why are you excited about that? And that would be the inventor kind of crafting it out beforehand. Not necessarily word for word that you have to say it, but, mapping it a little bit. And then when you deliver it, when you're sharing it, that would be the entertainer. Like, how are you presenting? What is your timing like? What's your pausing? How do you present that with confidence? And then one of my favorites, one of the techniques that I think is maybe not used enough is curator is fantastic for follow-up. If you ever need to follow up with someone and they haven't given you a response, one of my favorite things to do is based on our conversation, if we have this conversation, I reach out to you, I send you something, you don't respond for a week, I'm going to reach out back again and say, hey, Jack and Zach, I just saw this saying that made me think of you, and it's a link to something funny. It's a quotation, it's a meme, it's something that I've found that I think is going to make you laugh or smile. Made me think of you. By the way, if you have a response to that question, let me know. And then I send it. And so immediately that increases our response rate, because most people are like, oh, that thing that you sent was really funny. Hey, we still haven't made a decision yet, but thank you for this meme. Thank you for this joke. Thank you for whatever. And so in that interaction, you've curated humor. And what you might do, you might say, I stumbled on this, and you might really be like, I intensely research on Google a specific thing that I think that you might like. You don't say that part. But it might be very intentional, right? And that's curated humor. So you're going to use these different styles depending on the goal that you have.
I might actually try doing that, saying like, I've intensely researched this thing on Google and wanted to send it over to you because I'm a needy salesperson selling his soul, maybe. So what about from the other side of the business? And we do have business leaders, HR people that are in charge of looking after salespeople or the high pressure jobs. And they often get called in to have the tough conversations or the constructive conversations. So what's the role in humor in terms of diffusing a situation, and how do you get that balance right in those types of situations?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think, there's three areas in which humor can help in conflict moments and diffusing tension. The first is before it ever happens, right? Creating a culture and organization, right? The term within kind of a lot of people using now of creating psychological safety. And we consider humor to be a great litmus test for the culture of an organization, right? If people are laughing and smiling with each other, whoever they're laughing and smiling with, they tend to have a pretty good relationship with. If there is no laughter or smiling at all, then it probably means something is going on. And so it's important to kind of recognize that. But using humor first to create a space where people start to feel more comfortable with each other, there we encourage people to practice a principle from improvisation called yes and. To me, that 2-word phrase is one of the most helpful or best ways to start to develop a more psychologically safe organization. I'm more than happy to talk about more about that if that's of interest. But so the first one is setting that stage. Okay, how do we create this safe group? Then when those tense moments arrive, you can, if this is probably the hardest section to do it, you can use humor to diffuse tension in a moment. You can use it as what we consider a pattern interrupt. Because so often when tempers start to flare, etc., we lose a little bit of the insight of like, we're trying to solve this problem, and it gets more into like, now I'm trying to win this argument. Now I'm trying to beat you at this thing because I feel like you've wronged me, and so I've wronged you, and so now let's go. Now we're sparring, right? And so if you can do a pattern interrupt, and sometimes that's a simple observation. I remember in a meeting at P&G that I had many years ago, we were like in this conflict moment. We're in that kind of like, okay, now my goal is to beat you in this argument. My manager came in, asked what was going on. We were talking about it. Timber's flaring again. He's like, listen, we have to remember at the end of the day, we sell soap. Right? Because every P&G product can be traced back to soap or now paper, I guess, in some things. And so it wasn't to discount what we were doing. It wasn't to say what we were doing was completely unimportant. It was just to give us a little bit of perspective that we were not about to prevent World War III in this kind of like tiny room from an IT perspective. So let's take a step back. We needed that laugh. We released that tension. We could come back to it. So having some type of humor in the moment can help, but that's the riskiest one. Because if you don't do it well, depending on the circumstance, et cetera, people might think that you're making it more trivialized, et cetera. That's the hardest. The easier one is then what happens afterwards. After that tense moment, how are you using humor to let everyone else know that no hard feelings about that meeting or that situation? And that can be as simple as going up to the person and smiling. This is one of the disadvantages of virtual, is that if you used to in-person, if you have an in-person meeting and things are a bit contentious, then afterwards you can go over to that person, you can kind of make amends, you can ask how their weekend is going to be, and other people see it happening. They're like, oh, Jack and Zach, they're back on good terms again, they don't hate each other, great. If that all happens offline or in a virtual world and you never actually resolve it, then that can kind of build up over tension. So it has to be more intentional in a virtual environment, but it's about saying, okay, like, hey, sorry about before. I know that things were a little bit tense, but again, here, maybe I curated a little bit of humor for you to make you laugh or smile a little bit. Or let's create a little bit of a moment or connection, or yeah, let me ask some thing. Hey, how are things going with X, Y, or Z? So those are the 3 moments. I would say certainly before is the biggest one to really kind of work on from a strategy perspective is the culture. The after is the easiest one to kind of get started, to make amends. And then the middle one with practice and kind of levity and stuff can really be effective in the moment, but there's a little bit more challenge to it.
Just made me wonder about something as you were answering that then. If I was upset or angry or annoyed at someone, and then I laugh at something they say or do, am I still able to be mad at someone if I'm also laughing at them and finding them funny? Do those things, do you know what I'm trying to say? Does it turn down that emotion completely?
I don't know if it necessarily diffuses it completely, but maybe you've had this experience with a significant other. It happens all the time with me and my wife. If we're fighting, she gets mad. She gets fake mad that I made her laugh. When she was like, no, I want to be mad at you for this thing, but like, no, the thing you said was like really funny or whatever. And it's a way for us to have that pattern interrupt again because we have a 2-year-old at home. So we're new parents and we're still discovering that. And certainly the first 2 years is filled with a tremendous amount of love. Especially as an engineer, more emotions than I even knew were possible to feel. I've had as a parent and as a spouse, but we've had those tense moments, and a lot of times we're forgetting. We get so cycled into this one particular thing that we forget. Like, no, we're partners. We're in this together. It's us against whatever the challenge is, and so that laughter gives us that moment. And so yeah, she's fake mad at me, then like, no. No, don't do that. And so a lot of times it then kind of goes into a positive thing. Not always, right? But it does tend to, it can help. I don't think it necessarily completely reverses it, but it certainly starts to ease it a little bit.
It's really interesting you talking about the pattern interrupts, Andrew, because we're big fan of pattern interrupts in cold calls and sales meetings. And you remind, I'm going to be the curator for a moment here, but you reminded me of a video I saw the other day. It's off one of those dash cams, and there's a guy getting on a bike, and he's getting irate at this driver, and the guy, he's like, "You just pulled out of me," and he goes, "Oh my God, if you're this mad, you're definitely not invited to my birthday." And the driver just like starts cracking up, and it's like, oh, he hit him with a big pattern interrupt. It's like, how can I be mad? So you reminded me of that. Do you have any go-to? Because obviously I'm thinking about people buy from people like them. So I might get I can be really chirpy when I'm sat down with Zach, or I'm on a podcast with somebody like yourself. And then I get on a discovery meeting for a new business, and a big, bald, scary, angry 70-year-old CEO of a big company will sit there and like, right, get to the point. And then it's like, well, if I'm, hello, how are you? They're going to be like, well, no. So it's about kind of what hat do I wear? So how do we, for disgruntled customers or angry prospects, how can we use humor to lighten the situation? And sometimes will it have a detriment? Or I guess a counter question to that as well is, do you have any go-to pattern interrupts where you just like, I lay down this Uno card and it gets them every time?
Yeah, I mean, there's no, I mean, we've done programs, in person in 34 countries, 6 continents, depending on if you're in the U.S. kind of style that there's 7 continents and you include Antarctica. We haven't been to Antarctica yet. We'll get there. And we've done virtual programs for 100 plus countries or whatever. And what we have found is universally is that people laugh, but what they laugh at can vary drastically. And so there's no, I don't think there's any such thing as like a 100% success rate with humor. There's things that we like, for the most part, almost always works. But there are certain things that tend to work a little bit better. First of all is customizing and learning a little bit more about the person if you can. Right? If you know who you're going to be having a conversation with, can you search for them on LinkedIn or on Google, on like Twitter, etc., and find a little bit about them? And are they, people will search for me, and it's starting to happen where it's almost a little bit annoying, but it still gets me every time. Is like, I went to The Ohio State University in the U.S., which like we are very proud of that school for whatever reason, being a Buckeye, etc. And so immediately if someone starts a cold email or conversation with me as Go Bucks, I'm going to at least read further. Whereas other emails I might delete. And so it's saying, okay, are there certain connecting points that you have? Maybe you see on their LinkedIn that they're very big fans of, they follow Simon Sinek. So you might start your conversation with like, listen, I just want to start with why, right? Like Simon Sinek, and maybe you've done your research to know that they actually follow them, but now it's like, okay, now I'm listening, right? Because that's a thing that I like. So if you can do some type of small custom thing, if they've posted on Twitter about, how they so identified with Logan from Succession or whatever, then you're like, okay, that gives me insight into their personality. Maybe I start with the quote, or maybe I curate a little bit of humor from it or whatever. So customized things I think can help. I think particularly with people who are a little bit more, you give that impression of like maybe they're a little bit more no nonsense. They're that like kind of disgruntled, or the CEO where like my time is precious and don't waste it, etc. That's where I think incongruity is what we consider it from a humor point of view, or also what we call calling the room or calling the moment. And that's just kind of that almost like upright honesty that you're talking about. Like, one of my favorite examples of humor from sales is, I got this from a gentleman named Ian Altman, is that he had salespeople or new salespeople that would start all their cold calls with, this is a cold call. If you want to hang up, now's your chance. Where it was just that like, hey, there's this very honest thing. And he's like, people absolutely still hung up on him, but it did increase the amount that were like, okay, you've got 30 seconds, go. Right? And so it's not going to like work for every single person. So you might say that coming in, like, right? If you're very different, you're like, oh, I bet you didn't think that, your 5-year-old niece was going to come and talk to you today, right? If you look very young and compared to like how old or how experienced, we'll say not old, how experienced they are. Like calling a little bit the moment to say, because there's an interesting use of, like, to use humor oftentimes suggests a certain level of confidence. And it's the one thing, like, I have been on, very weirdly, like, I've been on, and there's a little bit of imposter syndrome that comes from it, but it's like, I've been on stages where the other people speaking are people who have like climbed Mount Everest or who have won Olympic gold medals or have been to space. Like they have all of these incredible accomplishments, and then they're like, here's this guy who wasn't funny before and is a little bit funnier now. That is essentially my resume. Right? Obviously worked at P&G and worked with a number of other companies, etc. But like that opens a lot of doors. And I've spoken to a lot of really big organizations, very senior level people, because of this skill of humor. And so if you have that, if you have the confidence, maybe it's not the funniest thing in the world, but the fact that you tried it. And again, it's not going to be a 100% success rate. But what's also interesting, particularly from a humor perspective, and doesn't always necessarily apply to, say, sales, et cetera, is like you start to identify your people, right? One of the things that we know in sales is that no isn't necessarily a bad thing. You just want to get to a no way fast. You don't want to spend, 7 months for it to always be a no. If you want to know pretty quickly, I know pretty quickly from the humor that I use whether or not I'm going to be right for a client. Because not every client, I'm not super aggressive in my humor. I'm not very political or anything like that. Like, so there's some people that are like, I didn't think he was that funny. It's like, well, I'm not a stand-up comedian. I'm not a comedy club. And so we should know that early on so that you're satisfied, that I'm satisfied, etc. Humor can help you do that. You can identify like, okay, they didn't like my sense of humor. Maybe they wouldn't have been all that fun to work with anyway.
You speak so much sense, and you're kind of singing to the choir over here. I feel like you should be a sales engineer as well, because a lot of what you're talking to definitely applies in the world of sales, and we open our cold calls by saying it's a sales call. Can I ask probably the most difficult question of the podcast so far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's the least funny country in the world?
I will. It's interesting because the stereotype is a lot of times people are like, oh, you've spoken in Germany. How was that? Fantastic. I loved it. They didn't get knock-knock jokes. I had a story about knock-knock jokes, and I was like telling this story because the longer story is that it was a way that I was helping a coaching client that actually like helped him transform his organization in a very weird way. And so I was like, and we can't talk about knock-knock jokes and not do the knock-knock jokes. So I was like, knock-knock, and they just stared at me. They're like, what is that? Don't you have a doorbell? What's going on? But no, they've loved it. My wife is German as well. And she has an incredible sense of humor. She gives me a ton of material because of maybe some of the things she's learned from a German upbringing, but it's actually wonderful. So I think every country so far that I've interacted with has a sense of humor. I can tell you though, the country where I have done the poorest, where I have apparently am not very funny, at least the one time that I did thing was in Malaysia. I did stand up in Malaysia, and this was, years ago, and I didn't do enough research about it. It was really kind of more on me, but like I do this stand-up show, and there's very little laughter throughout. And in my head, I was like, you know what? In some cultures, I know that people aren't always, very forthright with their laughter. Like sometimes, I've done events where people are pretty stone-faced while I've been presenting, and then afterwards they come up and, they've been, hey, that was one of the best programs I've ever seen. And it's like, no, I saw you the entire time. You didn't smile once, right? Like in speaking, there's a cliche that we say, like, if you enjoyed something, tell your face. Like express that on your face. Tell your face that you enjoyed it. So that didn't happen. So I thought maybe that was the case in this particular scenario. The comedian that got up after me crushed it. Was like, based on the audience reaction, was like the funniest person in the world. So I was like, oh no, this was clearly very much just me on this particular case, right? And so Malaysia for me didn't go well, but that's because I made a bunch of assumptions without customizing or learning more about the audience or the culture, etc. And so it didn't quite work. But I think, like I said, I think laughter is a human thing. That's why we say to humor is to human. I think pretty much every human on the planet has a sense of humor. You just may not always see it. Some people, shut it down because they feel like it's inappropriate in the workplace, or they have a very specific type of humor that you haven't necessarily been exposed to or seen. But I do think that everyone enjoys feeling joy in their body through laughter.
Okay. Malaysia is off the bucket list. I'm not going. Okay, so Andrew, you said earlier that obviously you're an introvert and you've learnt the skill. I imagine with learning that skill is overcoming the fear of rejection a lot, and to be in situations where you're going to try something, you don't know whether it's going to be good or whether you're going to get a laugh, and there's nothing worse than cracking a joke and everybody staring at you. So when it comes to rejection and being brave and being funny, how would you deal with rejection in those situations?
Yeah, I was very lucky, and this wasn't necessarily intentional, but looking back, I was very lucky in that my early rejections were, especially from a humor perspective, were in safe spaces. We're in improv, like, so I got pushed into comedy. So like I started doing improv and stand-up in university, and I didn't do it because I thought, you know who's funny? Me, right? You know who should listen to me? Strangers. Like, no, I didn't think that. I got pushed into it. You know, in my TEDx talk, I talk about that story a little bit of my best friend wanted to start an improv comedy group. He needed people and forced me to join. And I got better that way. And so what that means, though, is my first kind of attempts were humor were in an improv group where I knew everyone, we were all friends, and we were trying this thing out together where none of us were particular. Some were way better than others. I was towards, the bottom, but we were all learning this thing together. And then later I took a stand-up comedy class. And then I would do open mics where people know that no one expects you to be perfect at an open mic. Everyone is up there trying material that fails and doesn't do all that well. Then I moved to New York City when I was still at P&G, and I started taking improv classes. So an improv class was a safe space to fail, etc. And so it doesn't mean that you have to do those things, but to find those safe spaces to practice when you're first going. Because you don't want, I wouldn't suggest, hey, if you're listening to this podcast and you have the biggest meeting of your life tomorrow, right? The most important thing that you've ever done, to then immediately start with a story that you've never told before that you think is going to be so funny because your friends laugh at it. I'm not suggesting start there. Maybe run it by a few friends. Maybe talk to some of your coworkers, pull them aside and say, hey, I was thinking about starting with this. Because we need those practice and repetition. What I will tell you, though, is that practice and repetition in that safe space, one, gives you the confidence of what is funny, that skill of humor, and it gave me as a human way more confidence. Because I was an introverted kid. I was not someone that was going to be talking to strangers at a networking event or a party. I would never, my conversational skills with anyone I was romantically interested in or whatever were awful and awkward. It was the humor, it was the repetitions in this safe space of improvisation that gave me the skill set to practice some stand-up, that gave me the skill set to be a better speaker, etc. So it grew from there. So find your safe space wherever that happens to be to practice. And then over time, you start to learn, okay, maybe that's just not for this person. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, if you look at my TEDx talk on the skill of humor, it has over 13 million views. It has 200,000 likes on it, but it also has more than 5,000 dislikes, or at least that's how many it had before YouTube took away the dislike count. And if you read the comments, some of them are very positive. Some of them are this was great, or one person wrote in all caps, so I just imagine them screaming while typing it out. I think this video is genius and it's true what he said. And then there's a bunch that are comedic. One person is you can hear the nerd in his voice, which I think is true, or this dude's forehead is so big it has its own sense of humor, which I think is amazing. My favorite is I would pay to hear this guy sounds on helium. Because they have a high voice, right? So some are comedic. I find joy in those. I think they're very funny, even if people are insulting or trolling me. But the ones that used to hurt for a while were the ones this guy isn't funny. He's trying too hard. Yeah, he's copied a lot from other comedians. And there's a weird juxtaposition because some people would say this is the best TED Talk ever, and some people would say this was useless. One person said this was brilliant, witty, and entertaining. Another person said go back to engineering, please. Right? There's this whole mix. And for a long time, those negative comments did bother me. But because I had enough positive ones, because I've done this long enough, because I started to get impact, people would DM me or send messages or etc. of the impact that this talk has had, it's made me realize that every ounce of energy that I focus on the people who do, that don't resonate with the message, that don't find me funny, is energy that I'm not using on people who I can serve, who do resonate. And that goes a little bit back to that point of what I said is if you get so overwhelmed and caught up of what this person on a sales call may or may not think, you may never try humor, which means you may never succeed with some other people. Maybe you'll fail at some, but you'll probably succeed at some more, and some of those are probably going to be more fun in terms of interactions that you're going to have. And so I'd encourage you not to let that fear of rejection prevent you from even trying.
Really interesting. It's sort of, I've been thinking about this recently. We've had a few people on the podcast who their business is them. So it might be their name is the business. Yeah. So Zach Thompson is the business. And then when they get rejected, or the business gets rejected, it's so personal because it's so ingrained. So I suppose in your world, someone saying, "Oh, that wasn't funny," or whatever, that feels a bit more personal than if it was something you'd made from an engineering standpoint as part of a business, perhaps.
It can, yeah, and for sure when I first started out, and this is where, you know, I'm thankful of a mindset that I kind of learn, you know, or kind of, you know, surmise a little bit from improvisation and stand-up, is that failure is just data. Right? Failure is just data to say the thing that you just tried with that particular person did not work. And that's now information that, can I try it again? So if I do that again and try that same joke and it doesn't work, okay, then it's like, okay, I know that that's just not funny. Although Seinfeld says he'll do a joke 100, he has to do a joke at least 100 times to know if it's actually truly funny or not. Right? And so I'm not saying you have to do that in your own case in terms of that number, but it's like, okay, if I'm doing this one thing and it's not working pretty consistently, that's data to say, okay, maybe I need to change that, because it could have been just as other person. But it's like, okay, so maybe it doesn't work with that style. Maybe it's the idea that didn't work. It's that particular delivery. It's not your worth as a person. And that is hard to do, especially if your name is connected to the business. Like you said, if people are like, oh, you're not funny at all, then it's kind of a little bit of that imposter mindset of like, can I have a business then in any scenario? Like, is this am I done now, I guess? Because that one person said I'm not, and it's like, no, okay, I have enough successes to go back to. This was another, I can't remember where I've learned this technique, but I do have a repository of, you know, the emails that we've gotten, the testimonials that we've gotten, the positive things that we've gotten. And when I'm feeling down a little bit, I will go to them and remind myself like, okay, maybe it didn't work here for whatever reason. I need to parse through why that is. But there is still some proof that I'm at least a little bit fun. Because I don't think 13 million people watched my TEDx talk. I don't think some people clearly did because of the negative comments, but I don't think people are like, we're totally going to get him by giving him this praise and pretend it's real, but it's actually off. Like, I don't think enough people did that. So I have at least a little bit of belief that, okay, maybe there's something there. And that's something that I've started to learn as well, is if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't actually think you're funny. Hey, you're completely entitled to that opinion and completely respect it. Parse why. Why am I not funny compared to someone who you think is funny? And why might some people find me funny? Because I have proof to suggest that some people do find me funny. So what is it that some people might like? And can you use that for yourself? If you think you're funnier than me, fantastic. Go out and use it in the world. Become a better salesperson. Become a better leader. Do it to prove me wrong if you want to, as long as you go out and start to use a little bit of humor, and you can start to dissect a little bit to build that in your own skill.
Yeah, really. And again, that's probably your engineering mind able to seek evidence that will support or deny any imposter beliefs that are coming in, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of similarity between engineering and comedy, right? And to me, in some ways, comedy is math with words. But it is that iterative approach. Like anytime I'm writing something or anytime I'm working with someone one-on-one to add humor to their sales scripts or to their presentations, etc., it's never going to be perfect in that first thing. It's more about the iterations where, you know, version A to B might not be the best one, but from the time we go from version A to F or G or whatever, it's going to be way better.
Another thing that was fascinating was, so before your friend pushed you into comedy, what was the role of comedy in your life before?
A whole lot of Reader's Digest. I don't know if that resonates on an international scale.
Yeah.
As a kid, I loved reading. Like, my mom would get these Reader's Digest and have them laying around the house, and I would skip every article. I'd skip anything that was whatever. I would go just to the joke sections, to like the workplace humor, etc. Same thing with the newspaper. I wouldn't read the newspaper except for the comic strips, so I grew up on the Far Side and Calvin and Hobbes in terms of my favorites that I would read. And so it was primarily that. We also weren't allowed to watch TV during the week when we were growing up. So my mom had this thing where I was like, no, the week should be focused on schoolwork and family, etc. You can work Friday, you can watch stuff Friday night through Sunday. And so I missed out on a lot of conversations at school because we didn't have cable because we weren't watching TV a ton. And so kids would be like, oh, Nickelodeon, it was amazing. And we saw, Doug, I think, was a person or something. And it's like, I have no idea what you all are referencing. So like I was a little bit out there. So what we did instead was we made our own TV. We had my grandfather gave us a old school VHS video recorder where you had to like actually put the VHS in. It was bigger than us as kids. But we had that, and so we would try to make up things. And it wasn't particularly funny, but that was our like kind of little bit of a creative outlet. And so none of it was presentational. It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to go up and do the talent show level funny. I was not the class clown. I was voted teacher's pet my senior year because I was like the academic and the nerd and all those things. My after school activities were like the internet club at our school, like not the funny stuff. And so yeah, it truly wasn't until this person was like, and I joke because I learned a few years later that he didn't want me to join because he thought I was secretly funny. He wanted me to join because I was organized. Right? Like he was a naturally funny person, but he's like, we're going to need someone to like put this together. And that's what I was the project manager essentially of this group. And I just happened to learn to be funny through osmosis and then being a part of it.
Andrew, this conversation has been brilliant. I think I watched your TED Talk. I loved it. There was lots of takeaways. I think that to sit down and talk with you in this moment has been brilliant. I think for salespeople, leaders, business owners, husbands, wives, whoever they are, I think there's a lot of different communication tactics and skills that you could take away. For anybody that's listening that wants to watch you, find you, send you emails about Ohio, where can they find you? How can they get in touch? What should they do?
Certainly. Well, if you're from Ohio or have been, you can tell me if you prefer Grater's ice cream versus Jenny's ice creams. Those are the two. I'm a Grater's person, but there you go. There's a little bit of nuggets. So if you want to reach out and you want a cold email type thing to kind of reach out, there's one thing is be like, oh, I love black raspberry chip from Grater's ice cream. I promise you I will read that email if that is in the subject line, right? So that's that example of kind of customization as you learn a little bit about people. So if you want, we've got a bunch of free resources on our website, humorthatworks.com. That's humor spelled the U.S. English way, so only one U, Humor. But I think if you do the other, the international spelling of it, you'll get to our website anyway. But humorthatworks.com, we've got a bunch of free resources on there. We have a free 2-minute assessment where if you take that, it'll tell you what your primary humor persona is. So going back to those 7 personas, it will kind of give you an insight as to which one maybe is most natural to you based on kind of our side of things. So certainly do that. If you want to connect with me personally, if you want to get in touch, then I'm at Drew Tarvin on all social media. So LinkedIn is probably the thing that I'm on the most because I'm super hip like that. You can join me. You can send me a message on LinkedIn or any of the other social media platforms. I'm always more than happy to help and share because that's that. I got pushed into using humor, and a part of the story is also I had to get pushed a little bit later into using it in the workplace as well. And so my mission, my goal now is to push other people to use it a little bit more because it's absolutely transformed my life in terms of making me more confident, making me better at what I do, having a lot more fun kind of in life and in work. And so my mission is to give that gentle push to a few more people as well. So anyone that's kind of resonating with that, anything that I can do to help, please do let me know.
Incredible. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
There we